There is a sound that does not belong to the hour. It comes like a tiny breaking sharp, crystalline falling into the hush that gathers around the hearth. It is the sound of salt, a small handful, slipping from hand to stone floor in the dim light of the cottage, the air tight with wood smoke and the faint hiss of burning peat. Such a sound does not go unheard. It halts the rhythm of the room, as though the walls themselves know that something has broken loose. Eyes turn, breath stills, and in that pause there is fear not of the mess, but of what has been summoned. For in the old days, salt was not merely seasoning, it was covenant, it was ward, it was the boundary between the household and the dark. It came, dear, carried across mountains and down rivers, weighed out in coins and prayers. To waste it was to court famine, and to spill it was to let the enemy in. The elders said that salt held light within its pale crystals, a shimmer that no shadow could bear to cross. It could dry the tears of the earth, purify the vessels of the dead, and preserve the living from decay. But once loosed without intention, it could no longer be trusted to stand its watch. The remedy was swift and exact. The one who spilled must gather a pinch between thumb and finger, must lift it in silence, and must cast it over the left shoulder. Always the left, for it was there that the devil lingered, close enough to whisper but never to be seen. To throw the salt into his eyes was to blind him, to rob him of the power to follow one into dreams or into the years to come. In this, as in so many things, the gesture was small, but the weight of its meaning was vast. A man on the road might travel with nothing but bread, a knife, and a little pouch of salt wrapped in cloth. Women kept it near the cradle, tucked into linen, so that no spirit would dare exchange the child for one of its own. Soldiers salted the thresholds of tents, and sailors cast handfuls into the sea to appease what lived beneath. There were, tales always told low, near embers, that some who ignored the ritual came to harm in ways the priest could not name. A ploughman who left the salt where it fell awoke to find his best ox dead in the field. A merchant who laughed off his wife's warning found his ship wrecked within the month. The stories were not proof, only pattern, and in the Middle Ages pattern was reason enough. Salt carried other burdens, too. It was the price of loyalty and betrayal. There is an old Roman tale older than the cathedrals of men swearing oaths over salt, and of those who broke them coming to ruin. In medieval courts, it sat on the Lord's table as a silent measure of worth. Those seated above the salt were honored, those below it of lesser standing. Yet even in such pomp, the old fears clung like cobweb. Servants would guard the cellar with care, and should a sack be torn, they would whisper quick prayers before gathering the spill. Sometimes the fear came in dreams. A woman in Cornwall told of waking to see a shadow at her bedside, cold as stone. Whispering her name, she reached for the pouch at her neck, flung the salt over her shoulder without rising, and the shadow was gone before dawn. She lived into her 80s, and swore that without the salt, she would not have seen another sunrise. These were not the superstitions of the ignorant, as some would later claim they were the grammar of survival in a world that could turn cruel. Without warning, a bad harvest, an illness, a sudden storm could come without cause. To spill the salt and take no heed was to tempt such fate needlessly. And so the hand learned the motion before the mind thought of it. Even now, centuries past the burning of tallow in cottage hearths, the gesture survives. In kitchens bright with electric light, in restaurants where the hum of traffic lies beyond the door, a hand will spill a bit of salt and, without thinking, will toss it over the left shoulder. No one speaks of the devil, The eyes of the modern do not see him standing there, patient as he ever was. Yet the body remembers. The truth is this: fear leaves long roots in the soil of the human heart. Rituals grow around them like old trees, sheltering us from what we do not name. The salt, the shoulder, the motion, they are a language spoken to the unseen, an inheritance of those who lived when the night was deep and the earth was still, ruled by omens, somewhere, perhaps, in the great shadow that lingers just beyond the reach of the hearthlight. There is still a watcher, blinking against the sting of ancient salt, and in the shimmer of those tiny grains, we remain unseen. It comes suddenly, without warning, without consent, a convulsion of breath, sharp and unstoppable, as if something unseen has struck from within. The head bows, the chest heaves, the eyes clamp shut, and for the briefest heartbeat, the world goes silent, and then release, a sneeze flung into the air, carrying more than the breath that made it in the age before the clocks counted our hours and the street lamps drove back. The dark, that sound was no trifle. In the narrow lanes of medieval towns, where smoke curled from low chimneys and the stench of the gutter lay thick, a sneeze was a shiver through the soul, not merely for fear of sickness, though sickness lurked in every shadow, but for the old belief that in that single violent breath the spirit could be jolted from its vessel. The people whispered that the body was a house, the soul its tenant, and that a sneeze was like a door thrown open in a storm. For the span of an instant you stood undefended, your spirit half in this world, half already adrift, and the devil, who lingered just beyond sight, could snatch it as easily as a candle's flame is blown out. It was in this peril that the words came, short, sharp, urgent, "God bless you," not as pleasantry, not as courtesy, but as ward. The phrase was a clasp, a chain around the soul, a command that it return to its home, spoken quickly, before the devil could slip in. The words became as much a part of the act as the sneeze itself. And to remain silent when someone sneezed was to stand idle while a soul stood exposed in the plague years. When death's shadow lay thick over England, the ritual deepened. The sneezing could be the first sign, a warning that the invisible rot was already blooming in the lungs. To bless a sneeze was to offer more than a shield. It was to plead with heaven for mercy, to beg that the cough and the fever might yet be turned aside. The sound of the blessing and the sound of the sneeze became twinned breath, torn away, breath given back. There are scraps of story from those years. A boy in a Sussex village who sneezed thrice at market and was blessed thrice by strangers, yet by nightfall was burning with fever. A young woman who, after her husband's sudden sneeze, crossed herself and kissed his brow. He lived through the winter when many in the parish did not. The tales were proof to some, coincidence to others, but to all the blessing remained a necessity. Even among the learned, there was talk of the breath as a carrier of life itself. Physicians wrote of the heart pausing, the pulse stalling, in the instant of a sneeze. Monks in cold cloisters broke their chanting to bless a brother's sudden expulsion of air. Soldiers on muddy fields paused mid-march to offer the words to one who sneezed, lest the devil take advantage of the chaos. And it was not only the devil they feared. Some said the sneeze might scatter fragments of the soul itself, like sparks from a fire. Without a blessing, those sparks could drift away forever, leaving a hollow where a person once had been. The blessing then was not only protection, but gathering, calling the self back to itself. Picture it, a winter night, the wind clawing at the shutters, the hearth low. A man bends over his bread and broth, when a sneeze tears through him. His wife's hands are already lifting from her lap, the words already rising in her throat, urgent and low. God bless you, before he has even drawn breath again. She does not think. She does not need to. It is as natural as crossing oneself before sleep. The words travelled, as all spells do, across borders and seas. Traders carried them in the hum of their speech, priests in their blessings, mothers in their lullabies. They changed shape in other tongues, took on new sounds, but the heart of them remained the same, a plea, a protection, a call against absence. And though the centuries have washed the streets and emptied the plague pits, though the devil has retreated in name, if not in nature, the reflex lingers. You sneeze in a quiet room, and someone without turning, without thought offers the blessing. You smile, perhaps thank them, and think nothing of it. But in that moment, you have participated in something older than your name, older than your country, a chain of words forged in fear and faith, carried across generations. Perhaps somewhere in the deep that lies just beyond our knowing, the devil still waits by the open door, blinking at the force of 1,000 years of whispered blessings. And perhaps it is the words themselves, so often spoken without thought, that keep the latch closed. Night gathers at the edges of the village, swallowing the last of the daylight until only the faint orange flicker of hearths and candles marks the places where life holds fast, in that shifting half-dark, where the wind carries strange whispers between the cottages. Doors are bolted, shutters drawn tight, and over many of those doors, nailed in deliberate silence, hangs a small curve of blackened aruna shape, so humble that the unknowing might pass beneath it without thought. But for those who live here, it is no ornament, it is a sentinel. They say, the story begins in the time of Saint Dunstan, a man both holy and cunning, whose hands were skilled in the work of the forge. The devil, curious or mocking, came to him in the guise of a traveller and asked for his hoof to be shod, as if he was some common beast. Dunstan, recognizing the eyes that glowed faintly red and the sly curl of the smile, agreed, but when the iron was hot, he seized the hoof with his tongs and nailed the shoe not gently, but deep, so deep that the devil cried out. The tale says, Dunstan would not release him until he swore an oath never to cross the threshold of any home marked by a horseshoe. Bound by his own promise, the devil slunk away, and the arc of iron became a charm against his entry in the centuries that followed. The story travelled along the roads as steadily as the wagons that left their ruts in the mud. Blacksmiths kept the legend close, folding it into the rhythm of hammer and anvil, and the people believed not merely in Dunstan's trick, but in the deeper, older magic of iron itself. Iron, pulled from the bones of the earth, carried the memory of fire and the weight of the forge. It was said to sing against witches, to bind demons, to silence spirits that whispered at windows. A found horseshoe, worn smooth by the endless road, carried with it the luck of the traveller who had once ridden above it. To find such a relic was no accident, it was a gift. But to keep its power, you could not toss it aside or hang it carelessly. The placing was ritual. Some nailed it with the ends pointing upward to hold the luck like water in a vessel. Others turned it down, letting fortune spill into the lives of those who passed beneath. In either case, it was always fixed above the door, never on a wall, never in the barn alone, for it was the home that must be guarded most fiercely. Picture it, a mother in a thatched cottage, the wind clawing at the thatch, wolves howling in the tree line beyond the fields. She kneels with a candle, its flame wavering, while her husband drives the last nail through the iron curve into the wood above their door. Outside, the dark deepens, but within, there is the comfort of belief that no evil thing will step inside while that guardian holds its place. Travellers told of cottages that burned to the ground while the horseshoe remained, blackened but unbroken, in the rubble. They told of sickness that swept through a village but stopped at the threshold of one home marked, as always, by the dark crescent of iron. And in the telling, the horseshoe grew more than metal. It became a spell in plain sight. Blacksmiths, keepers of fire, were treated with a mixture of gratitude and caution. To wield the forge was to hold the tools of both blessing and curse. When a horseshoe was hammered into shape, the ringing of iron on iron was more than sounded, was the hammer driving away the unseen, each strike a banishment. The curling, smoke, the hiss of water quenching heat, all seemed part of the rite. Even now, the thought lingers that the iron remembers, that it keeps the promise St. Dunstan forced from the devil, holding it like a seal in metal, that it listens for the hoofbeats of darkness and, when they draw near, turns them away. There is something haunting about its simplicity. No carved saint, no holy relic of gold, just the curve of metal shaped by human hands, lifted from the earth, tempered by fire. Yet in that humble form lives centuries of fear and defiance, the stubborn will to keep the night outside where it belongs. And if, one evening, you pass beneath such a charm, perhaps you will feel it a faint pressure at your back, as though something that followed you has stopped at the door, unable to go farther. Perhaps you will sense the weight of all the blessings, bargains, and whispered prayers it has absorbed. And perhaps, without meaning to, you will glance upward at the old iron arc, and breathe easier for its presence. The sky has a language older than words. It speaks in the slow pull of clouds across the horizon, in the sudden flash that opens. The heavens, in the roar that follows, like the anger of something vast and unseen. And in the high places and the jagged ridges, where the earth seems to scrape the very belly of the sky, there were once those who claimed they could answer back. They were called tempestary, weather-makers, storm-callers. The villagers spoke. Their names were the mixture of prayer and curse, for no one was certain whether their power came from God, the saints, or something far darker. It was said that with a whispered incantation they could scatter the thunderheads before the hailstones fell upon ripening grain, or with a muttered curse and a glance skyward they could summon a black cloud to roll across the sun, turning day into dusk. In the thin, cold air of the mountains, life bent to the will of the weather. Fields carved into the slopes could yield gold in wheat, or nothing but hunger, depending on the moods of the wind. Every storm was a gamble, and so the people turned to those who claimed to hold the dice. Palm Sunday blossoms, saved from the churchyard and dried above the hearth, were carried into the fields before planting. They were laid gently on the furrows, a fragrant plea for the sky to be merciful. The church bells, their bronze throats, ringing into the clouds, were said to shatter hailstones in mid-arch peal, a hammer striking against the invisible anvil of the heavens. But the greatest safeguard, the villagers believed, was to keep the tempestuous content. A loaf of bread left on the doorstep, a skin of wine delivered without knocking, coins slipped into a hand without a word. The gifts were offerings, but also bargains. Protect our fields, and we will protect you. Yet the contract was fragile, written not on parchment, but in fear. For when the wind rose without warning, when the horizon bruised purple and the air thickened with the scent of rain, the eyes of the village turned inward. If the storm came and destroyed the crop despite the offerings, the ale lay heavy as bone fragments across the ruined stalk. Someone would be blamed, and blame always found the tempest. Arius. It did not matter if they had been seen in the fields praying for clear skies, or in the chapel lighting candles before the saints. The old belief was stronger, that their power could be turned against the very people they served, whether in malice or in payment to forces beyond comprehension. So it was that the same hands that once brought bread and wine could grip stones or rope. The Tempestarius might be driven from the village in a night of shouts and torchlight, their home pulled apart, their names spit into the dirt. Others were hanged in the square beneath the tolling of the same bells that had once been rung to call down mercy. The ropes swayed in the wind, and the people told themselves the weather would be kinder without such dangerous company. But the storms did not listen year after year. The clouds returned, hail still fell, thunder still cracked across the sky like the breaking of worlds. And in the long dark nights, when the wind roared down from the high ridges, some villagers found themselves wishing quietly, guiltily for the tempestuous again. They wondered if perhaps those strange men and women had indeed been guardians, walking a narrow line between the wrath of the heavens and the frailty of the earth, that perhaps each storm they turned away had been one that might have been worse, far worse, if left unchallenged. The old stories say that the Tempestari did not die with their names cursed in the square. They went into the mountains, into the hidden valleys where no roads lead, and there they speak still to the sky. The clouds that drift above those ridges sometimes pause, as if listening. The wind sometimes curls strangely, carrying a scent of blossoms out of season, and perhaps, on certain evenings, when the clouds gather in their slow, bruised procession, and the first raindrops fall heavy as beads of glass, you may feel it that someone unseen is standing between you and the full fury of the storm, that there is a voice raised in the language of the sky, bargaining still in that moment. You might understand what the old villagers knew too late, that the storm was never wholly enemy, and the tempestuous was never wholly friend, but a bridge of fragile flesh between the two, holding back the sky with nothing but breath, prayer, and peril. A feast hall shivers in the trembling glow of candlelights, the air thick with the mingled scents of burning tallow and freshly baked grain. Amid the murmurs of gathered voices and the clink of wooden plates, the eye catches upon one detailer, single loaf of bread, inexplicably turned upside down. Its golden crust, once a promise of nourishment and life, now an emblem of unease, a silent omen woven into the fabric of medieval fear. In the hushed corners of village lore, it is said that executioners, those sombre arbiters of life and death, were given their daily bread placed face down. This inversion was no mere accident, but a mark, a sign that carved out a boundary between the ordinary and the feared. To hand an executioner a loaf thus flipped was to brand their fate and their role with a quiet, trembling dread. They were to be feared, untouchable, a necessary shadow among the living. The bread, simple and sacred, bore the weight of such symbolism. To invert it in a household was to invite the hunger spiriter, creeping, whispering wraith that gnawed at the edges of fortune and health. The gesture could unravel the fragile threads holding a family's fate together, inviting famine or misfortune to sit heavy in the hearth. The common folk, the bakers kneading flour with weathered hands, the church folk tending the altars and offering prayers, all knew that the daily loaf was more than mere sustenance. It was a talisman against chaos, a pact silently struck between humanity and the unseen forces that shaped their fragile existence. The ritual of bread was etched into the rhythms of life. Before slicing, a cross might be drawn upon its crust, a whispered invocation to divine protection. If accidentally flipped, the careful hands would right it immediately, almost as if mending a fragile wound. To leave it inverted was to invite ruin, a slow decay that began with empty cupboards and ended in desolation. The bread had learned to guard itself through these rites, just as people had learned to guard their spirits and their lives. Through ritual, each loaf a prayer carried out in grain and fire in the darkened corners of medieval kitchens. Beneath the hearth's glow, bread was a guardian, its warm crust a shield against starvation, its form a sentinel in the endless battle between survival and despair. Each loaf was a story, each crumb a prayer, and the simple act of turning it upside down became a symbol heavy with dread, a quiet sentence that echoed in the hearts of those who lived in the shadow of famine and fear. And so, in the flickering candlelight, the upside-down loaf rests, not merely a piece of food, but a silent witness to the ancient dance of hope and dread. The bread, like those who break it, carries within it the fragile weight of life's delicate balance, a balance guarded not just by hands and ovens, but by whispered rites and trembling gestures, binding together the mortal and the sacred in a daily act of survival. In that still moment, where flame meets crust and shadow softens the edges of a forgotten fear, the bread remains an eternal symbol of the unseen threads that weave humanity's fate. Fragile and steadfast beneath the ever-turning wheel of fortune, a newborn's cry breaks the night. Raw and trembling, a fragile sound, a first breath drawn into a world thick with shadows and whispered fears. Outside the humble hearth, a mother moves with solemn care, setting down a pair of tiny shoes upon the wooden table. The air hangs heavy, as if the room itself holds its breath. Beneath the flicker of candlelight, the shoes rest there not mere leather and thread, but talismans charged with an ancient weight. In the silence that follows, the night seems to lean closer, trembling with a silent warning whispered through the ages. In the flickering light of medieval homes, the placement of footwear was no trivial matter. Shoes set upon a tableau place of sustenance, conversation, and the sacred ritual of daily bread was a gesture that invited calamity. The superstition was as old as the worn stone walls themselves, carried from whispered mouths to trembling hands. It was said that shoes perched on such a surface beckoned death, a shadow passing unseen through the threshold. Like a door left ajar to unseen watchers, the shoe on the table was an invitation, a breach in the fragile barrier between life and doom. This belief carried across the rhythms of daily life, woven into the fabric of crafts and trades. Apprentices and miners, those who delved deep beneath the earth's skin, hushed their voices when worn boots found rest atop the table's surface. It was a silent signal that fate's hand hovered near, that luck wavered like a candle flame. Caught in a draught, actors, cloaked in the artifice of the stage, feared the cursed step. The ill omen of shoes on the dressing-room table meant a show doomed from the first line. Their performances, once bright with hope and laughter, might unravel in shadow and misfortune. In this strange alchemy of superstition, the ordinary became charged with sacred power. A shoe was no longer just a vessel of travel and toil. It became an egg of fate, fragile and potent. Its placement was a prayer, a careful negotiation with unseen forces that held sway over hearth and heart. To place shoes incorrectly was to tempt a restless spirit or call forth a cursor, risk not taken lightly in homes where survival balanced on the sharp edge of luck. Stories breathed life into this fear. Some said the shoe's presence on a table was the restless mark of criminals hanged, their shoes flung in scorn or sorrow. The echo of their doomed footsteps lingered in the worn souls, cursed to wander even in death. Others spoke of the shoes as vessels of respect, a way to honor the spirits that watched over the home's safety, if only placed just so and not in defiance. In these tales, the shoe held a fragile duality, a symbol of protection and peril, its meaning shifting with the angle of light and the gaze of those who dared to see. The superstition seeped into the quiet moments of life, the mother placing tiny shoes near her child, a silent shield against the shadows that lurked beyond the flickering fire. The farmer, weary from the fields, taking care never to rest his boots where they might invite darkness. The traveler pausing at the threshold, mindful of the unspoken pact between the feet that walked the earth and the spirits that claimed the space between. Each shoe a quiet sentinel, a guardian of the fragile boundary where luck and doom danced their ancient waltz. Yet within this weighty ritual lay a whisper of human fragility, longing to grasp some small measure of control in a world carved by chaos. The shoe on the table was a silent prayer, a careful act that bridged the seen and unseen, the known and the unknowable. It was the language of caution, spoken without words, but heavy with meaning, a testament to the way ordinary lives intersected with extraordinary fears in the dim candlelight. As shadows gathered and the newborn's cries softened into slumber, the shoes rest quietly on the table. They are more than mere objects. They carry within them the breath of countless stories, the echo of countless hopes and terrors. Their stillness is a fragile promise, a whispered pact between those who walk the earth and the unseen watchers, who trace their steps in silence. And so, beneath the weight of night, the humble shoes stand sentinel, not just of feet that tread the soil, but of a world woven with unseen threads. They hold the memory of caution and the edge of fate, guarding the fragile spaces where life and shadow meet. In their quiet presence lies the echo of ancient fears, the soft murmur of prayers spoken without voice, and the eternal dance of protection and peril that shapes the human heart beneath the endless sky, beneath a cold and restless moon. Shadows lengthen and twist, weaving silent tales on crumbling stone walls. A shape moves half-man half-wolf, its form slipping between flesh and fur, between the known and the forbidden. A breathless howl pierces the midnight stillness, reverberating through ancient forests where the trees hold secrets older than memory. This is a world where the boundary between human and beast is as fragile as a whispered prayer, where darkness is not only absence, but presence so lurking, shifting force that waits just beyond the edge of sight. In the chill of medieval Europe, where villagers huddle beneath thatched roofs and church bells toll through misted valleys, belief in the werewolf was no mere superstition, was law, judgment, and dread woven into daily life. Under the reign of Canute the Great, the sacred and the secular collided in grim courts where accusations of lycanthropy were weighed with grave seriousness. A man transformed by moonlight was not only a sinner but a danger, a creature straddling two worlds, condemned both by God's law and earthly power. The codices of the time speak of trials where the accused stood trembling beneath flickering torchlight eyes, haunted by suspicion and fear. Was this man a wolf in truth, or a man bewitched, cursed to wear the beast's skin beneath a cruel moon? The punishment was often death, the executioner's blade swift to sever the curse or the sinner. Yet, amid these grim reckonings, a deeper struggle lingered how to judge a soul caught between flesh and shadow. Augustine's church fathers wrestled with the notion, condemning lycanthropy as sin and deception. Yet tales whispered in cottages told of transformations that defied reason and mercy alike. Villagers spoke in hushed tones of neighbors who vanished beneath the silver light, only to return with eyes wild and teeth bared, haunted by something ancient and relentless. They told of curses past like dark heirlooms, of bloodlines marked by the moon's cruel pull. The werewolf was sin made flesh, a walking penance for hidden transgressions. But for others, the beast was a strange hoper, plea for strength in a world fractured by hardship and fear. To wear the wolf's skin was to touch power beyond mortal grasp, a force fierce enough to protect or destroy. In the thick woods where moonbeams scarcely reached, the line between man and beast blurred like smoke in a lantern's glow. Every rustle, every breath of wind became a portent. The howls were not just cries, but echoes of ancient pacts, forgotten bargains with shadows. The werewolf was more than legend. It was the night's pulse, the heart of fear and fascination beating beneath the fabric of medieval life. And yet, even as law condemned and church excommunicated, the stories endured, carved in whispered confessions and flickering firesides. In the tremble of hands, clutching crosses and knives, the werewolf was a mirror to humanity's darkest edges, a reflection of the beast within the man, the wildness beneath the veneer of civilization. It was the eternal struggle of identity and otherness, power and damnation, flesh and spirit entwined beneath the unforgiving gaze of the moon. As dawn crept slow and pale across the land, the howls faded, leaving only the cold silence of empty forests and hollowed hearts. The werewolf vanished into myth once more, but the shadows lingered, waiting, watching, reminding all who dared listen that beneath the skin lies a fragile truth. Between light and dark, between law and legend, the wolf's breath still stirs the night, and the line between man and shadow remains perilously thin. A stillness hung in the dimly lit chamber, a fragile calm woven between the flicker of a single candle and the slow, shallow breaths of a sleeping child. Outside, the wind whispered through ancient oaks, carrying voices not of this world's soft, elusive murmurs of realms unseen. In medieval Britain, such silence was often broken not by sickness alone, but by the haunting suspicion that the child, cradled so tenderly, might not be what he seemed. A changeling they called Itan, otherworldly impostor left in place of the true child, stolen away to realms beyond mortal grasp. In these shadowed days, when medicine was whispered in riddles, and superstition cast long shadows, the fragile infant became the battleground between worlds. The changeling was a token of the fie's caprice, mischievous spirits or sorrowful fairies who, it was said, coveted human children for reasons lost to time and myth. To watch a child fail beneath fevered skin was to glimpse a deeper, darker possibility that the living babe was but a mask, a clever imitation hiding centuries of faerie memory. Families faced this terror with trembling rituals. The mother, eyes heavy with fear and hope, might float her child upon eggshell water, clear, fragile, like the boundary between this world and the next. Should the child laugh or cry, such signs betrayed the faerie impostor within. Or a shoe might be set to boil in the soup, pater, simple earthly object, a charm against the ethereal. Laughter in the house, as such a moment was a cruel confirmation. The changeling mocked the attempt, revealing in mirth what sickness disguised among whispered tales. One endures a changeling who spoke, unbidden, confessing 1,000 years of memory caught in the shape of a babe. The parents, desperate and wary, set forth breadcrumb tests and flames to draw the truth from myth. These rites, woven of fear and longing, were the fragile cords tethering the living to hope, to explanation, beyond the limited light of medieval healing. In the flickering firelight, magic became medicine. Enchantment a mirror held up to the frailty of flesh. The child's pale face, a canvas for both mortal ailment and faerie enchantment, blurred the lines between belief and reality. Was the sickness merely weakness, or a veil hiding an ancient sorrow? Was the changeling a creature of malice or a sorrowful exile caught between worlds? In the silent watch of the night, parents became both healers and wardens, guardians against a fate whispered in shadows, a fate that might steal their child from them forever. The test of flame and bread, of eggshell and laughter, was not merely ritual, but a sacred dance with fear itself. It spoke to the human heart's yearning to grasp the unseen, to wrest control from the capricious hands of fate. In these fragile moments, the changeling became more than myth. It became the embodiment of all things lost to sickness, to death, to the cruel cruelties of a world that offered no clear answers. As dawn's pale light stretched across that ancient cottage, the mother's vigil might yield relief or despair, but never certainty. The changeling's tale remained suspended between the world of men and the realm of Faerie eternal, riddle whispered beneath breath and prayer. It is a story not just of stolen children, but of the fragile boundary between love and loss, between reality and the delicate enchantments that shape human hope. In the quiet aftermath, when the candle gutters and the child sleeps where the changeling or flesh there lingers, a profound truth. Sometimes the deepest mysteries are those where healing lies not in knowing, but in the sacred embrace of what cannot be seen, only felt. The changeling, silent and still beneath the moon's watchful eye, is the mirror of human frailty and echo of love's desperate magic in a world veiled by shadow and light. The hour hung heavy and black, a cloak pulled tight across the sky. Midnight breathed slow and silent, save for the faint, anxious tapping of a baker's fingers against a wooden table. 13 eggs, counted one by one beneath flickering candlelight. 13, the number whispered in dread, shadowed by centuries of fear. To crack an egg and find a double yolk, to catch the sudden cry of a lone bird, to shatter a mirror, these were not mere accidents, but signs woven into the fragile tapestry of fate, each one a thread threatening to unravel in the dim streets of medieval Europe. Superstition was the silent pulse that governed the rhythm of life, a language older than spoken words, older than the stones beneath worn shoes. The number 13 was more than a tally. It was a portent, a whispered curse folded into the very breath of the night. It hovered like fog around hearths and taverns, lurking in the cadence of prayers and the cautious gestures of daily ritual. To live was to negotiate with this unseen force, to whisper bargains into the dust where chance and destiny collided. Eggs, symbols of birth and renewal, bore their own secret weight. At Easter, they carried hopes and fears alike. A double yolk in the nest was a blessing whispered through trembling lips, a sign of twins, or a wedding soon to bloom. Yet even this blessing teetered on the knife's edge of fate. The cracking of an eggshell, the spilling of its fragile white and gold, echoed like a confession, a fissure in the fragile wall that separated the ordinary from the uncanny. Bakers, women, and children learned to handle these tokens with reverence, for they were talismans in a world poised precariously on the cusp of blessing and ruin. Mirrors, too, were enchanted objects, glass traps for wandering spirits and forgotten prayers. The shattering of a mirror was a shattering of the soul's delicate balance. 7 years of misfortune whispered in the shards, a shadow cast long and cold across futures yet unwritten. To break a mirror was to invite the gaze of the other world, to crack open the door between worlds and let slip the wild unknown. Families hid mirrors behind cloth, turned their faces away, or knelt in silent supplication, hoping to seal the breach with whispered rites. Outside, the cry of a bird sliced through the night, a blackbird's mournful call or a crow's rasping summons. These cries carried meaning as sharp and cruel as the chill in the wind. To hear a bird's cry at the threshold was to feel the brush of death's wing, a message carried from shadows to waking flesh. Doors were bolted, candles lit, prayers muttered beneath breath. The natural world was a mirror for human fear, a reflection of the fragile thread by which life was suspended. Everyday actions became rituals of survival. To knock on wood was to touch the living heart of the world, to summon protection from the unseen watchers. To spill salt was to invite chaos, and so it had to be cast over the left shoulder, blindfolding the eye of evil that watched with jealous hunger. These small acts were not folly, but the grammar of life itself, spoken in silence and shadow, a code deciphered by trembling hands and whispered hearts, in the quiet kitchens where loaves rose and dough was kneaded, where fires flickered and shadows danced on ancient stone walls. Superstition was a talisman. It was a prayer folded into the crease of every cracked pot and crooked shadow. It was a covenant between the fragile human spirit and the merciless caprice of chance. Every omen was a ledger balanced carefully by ritual, every gesture a stitch in the fragile fabric holding disaster at bay. The baker, counting eggs with a breath caught tight in his chest, knew that the number 13 was a thread pulled too hard could unravel all. The eggs sat there, fragile worlds of potential, each shell a barrier between safety and chaos. To touch them was to dance with fate, to feel the weight of history pressing down in a silent song of warning. The candlelight flickered, shadows stretched like silent witnesses, and the night waited, breath held, for what would come next. In the deep quiet that followed, the moment stretched thin, time suspended between heartbeat and eternity. The cracks in mirrors, the cries of birds, the broken eggs, these were not mere accidents, but echoes of a truth too ancient to name. They were the language of a world held together by fragile threads, the whispered contracts between flesh and fate. And as the night deepened, the baker's trembling hand lifted an egg, the shell a delicate threshold between what was and what might be. In that fragile orb lay the suspended breath of centuries, the fragile dance of luck and doom. Life and loss woven into the ordinary with threads of fear and hope. The eggs, the birds, the mirrors, they told a story older than memory itself. That the world is fragile, that luck is a shadow we chase, and that beneath the quiet surface of everyday life, the unseen watches, waits, and whispers its eternal song. In the hush of a winter night, when frost clung to every shutter and the wind moved through the village like a whisper of forgotten prayers, a midwife bent over her small table and struck flint to steel. The spark caught on a curl of linen. Then, on the wick of a slender candle dipped in vermilion wax, its flame rose, trembling in the cold air. as though it too felt the weight of the hour. Outside, the snow lay heavy across the thatched roofs, muting every sound. The moon hid behind a veil of cloud, leaving only the dim glow of hearths and this one small light in the birthing chamber. It was Candlemas, the second day of February, when the church blessed its candles to ward off storm and shadow, to guard fields and barns, to push back what Noah could name. The midwife, her hands worn smooth as river stones, placed the red candle on the low table beside the straw-padded bed. Its hue was not by chance. Red for the blood that bound mother and child, for the lifeblood that demons coveted, for the ancient belief that fire of this color could blind the gaze of malice. She crossed herself, not in haste, but in the slow, deliberate manner of one who has seen life and death pass too often beneath her hands. In the corners of the room, shadows folded themselves like cloaks. The air smelled of damp wool, hot broth, and the faint bitterness of smoke from the hearth. The mother, her breath shallow, clutched the coarse linen beneath her. Each contraction came like a wave in the dark, and with each one the candle trembled. As if sharing her pain in the villages of this land, the flame was more than light, it was a boundary. The midwife knew the old sayings, learned in whispers from her grandmother, that no spirit could cross the circle of a blessed flame, that the flicker was a blade drawn against the unseen. For cattle, they would press a wax cross against the barn door, sealing the herd from sickness. For the dying, they would set candles at the bedside, to light the path to God and keep the wandering dead from straying too near. But here, now, it was for a child, for a soul not yet fully here, and a mother whose own life hung in the balance. The midwife's fingers moved with the calm of long habit, arranging the linens, murmuring prayers that blended the language of saints with words older than the church. She dipped her head toward the candle flame, letting its light touch her face, as if borrowing a shard of its strength. A knock of wind pressed against the shutters, rattling them in their frame. The midwife turned her head sharply toward the sound. For an instant, the flame bent low, guttering in the draught, and a thread of fear passed through her. She whispered the prayer again, louder this time. Outside, the wind sighed and passed on, and the candle straightened. The mother cried out, and the midwife moved to her side. Time thinned into a narrow thread, measured not in hours, but in the rhythm of breath and pain. The candle's flame, though small, became a world. Its glow gilded the curve of the mother's cheek, the arch of the midwife's brow, the beads of sweat forming at the hairline. It threw shadows that danced like phantoms against the low rafters. In the old tales, birth was a crossing place, a threshold like death, and the midwife was both ferryman and sentinel. She stood between two shores, the world of the living and the place where souls waited, and her tools were not swords but herbs, cloth, hands, and flame-duct. At last the child came, wet and wailing, into the circle of light. The midwife lifted the small body, holding it so the first breath would be drawn in the glow of the blessed candle. The cry rose, cutting through the quiet like a bell. Outside, the snow still fell, but inside, the air shifted, the space seemed warmer, larger, as though the room itself had exhaled. The mother lay back, eyes closed, a single tear sliding down her temple. The midwife worked in silence, wrapping the child, wiping the mother's brow, letting the flame stand guard as she had promised it would. For a moment, all three, the midwife, the mother, and the child, were bound together in the red-lit stillness. Later, when the child was safe at the mother's breast, the midwife stepped to the window. She opened the shutter just enough for the cold air to touch her face and whispered a blessing into the night. The candle burned on, its wax pooling at the base, its light unbroken. She thought of the many times she had seen such candles burn, beside the bed of an old man whose breath was slowing, on the sill of a barn to guard the calving cows, in the chapel when storms clawed at the village roof. Always the same small flame, fragile as breath, and yet somehow enough to hold the dark at bay. The midwife returned to the bed, checking the child's breathing, tucking the blanket tighter. She knew the candle must burn until the mother slept, until the thread between worlds was thick enough to hold fast. Some said that if a candle went out too soon, the spirits could slip in like thieves. When the moment came, she pinched the wick between two dampened fingers, snuffing the light. A faint spiral of smoke rose, curling toward the rafters before dissolving into the dark. The room seemed colder without it, but the midwife felt the quiet settle deep. The work was done. In the years to come, the child would grow, perhaps never, knowing that on the night of his birth, a single red flame had stood as his sentinel. Perhaps the mother would tell him, or perhaps it would fade into the hush of family memory. But the midwife knew. She carried it with her, as she carried all. The nights of flickering light and whispered prayers, the countless thresholds crossed. Outside, the snow eased. The first grey light of dawn bled into the edges of the sky. Somewhere a cock crowed, breaking the last seal of night, and in a small house at the edge of the village, a woman slept with her child beside her, watched over by nothing more and nothing less than the memory of a flame. The midwife closed the door softly behind her. Her footprints pressed into the snow, vanishing as the wind passed. The day would be filled with other tasks, other births, other deaths, but for this night she had held the line between the living and the shadows, and though the candle was gone, its light still lingered, fragile, vulnerable, eternal. It began as the faintest sound, barely more than a flutter in the dark. The soft shuffle of feet on worn boards, the creak of an unseen beam overhead, the distant crackle of a hearth that had burned too low. Then, in the long hush of the hall, a small, sudden breath drew in sharp, involuntary, and tore loose again with a child's sneeze. The sound leaped through the candlelit corridor like a startled bird. Shadows along the walls shivered, wax dripped in slow, thick beads from the sconces, their flames bending slightly, as if the air itself had been disturbed by something more than breath. In the far corner, an old woman crossed herself without thinking. In these years, such a sound was not harmless. It was the plague years, when even the smallest cough was a herald of grief. Outside, the streets lay damp under a sky the color of wet ash. Within, homes shuttered themselves against a sickness that came without warning and lingered without mercy. People spoke in low tones, and when they touched one another, it was with the caution of those who know how fragile flesh can be. In this narrow village hall, a few souls had gathered for warmth, each trying to pretend they were not counting every cough, every tremor, every too pale face. The child sat near the wall, head bent, clutching a woolen shawl around her shoulders. She was no more than 8, her cheeks flushed with the kind of fever that might yet be nothing or might be the first mark of doom. The sneeze had startled her, too. She pressed her small hands to her mouth, eyes wide. From the shadows, someone murmured, "God bless you." The words came gently, almost shy, yet they carried weight. They traveled through the smoky air like a ribbon of warmth, binding themselves around the child. In times like these, blessings were not courtesy, they were shield, ward, plea. Long before the sickness swept across the land, people had believed that a sneeze might open the body's gates, that for the briefest heartbeat the soul might tremble, loose, ready to flee, ready to be stolen by whatever waited just beyond sight. To speak a blessing was to call the soul back, to stitch it into the body with the thread of a holy word. But now, with the plague creeping through alleyways and marketplaces, the meaning deepened. A sneeze was not just the flight of the soul, it was the breath that might carry death to another. And so the blessing became twofold: a call for God to guard the one who sneezed, and to spare all others who breathed the same air dot in the hall. The child's mother bent low, pressing her lips to the crown of her daughter's head. The blessing was echoed again, quieter this time, as if repetition might make it stronger. Across the room, a man who had lost his wife the week before closed his eyes and mouthed the words. In their hearts, all knew the same truth. There was no cure, no true defense, only the small mercy of human care. Outside, a church bell rang not the fast, panicked peal that signaled fire, but the slow, measured toll for another burial. The sound threaded through the hall, counting time like a great heartbeat. In every home, candles burned against the shadows, their flames hunched against the draughts that slid beneath doors. The midwife, seated near the hall's far end, remembered other years, other sicknesses. She had said blessings over the sneezes of newborns, over the dying when their last breath rattled in their chest. But in this season, every breath felt like a choice the body might not make again. She leaned forward, letting the candlelight carve her face into planes of gold and shadow, and added her own murmur of blessing to the air. There was an unspoken ritual to it. The moment the sneeze broke the air, that paused the heartbeat's gap when all eyes turned, and the soft rush of the blessing, meant to fill whatever space had opened. No one spoke of whether it worked. It was enough to say it, enough to do something rather than nothing. As the night deepened, the villagers stayed close to the walls, leaving the center of the hall open as though the sickness itself might walk. There, if given the space, the child, growing tired, leaned her head against her mother's side. Her eyes fluttered shut, the fever's flush still warm on her cheeks. Around her, the grown ones watched, each with their own ghosts of memory brothers lost, neighbors buried, the empty chairs at their own tables, in some corners of the land. It was said that the devil took special notice of the sneeze, for it was a crack in the body's fortress. In others, the belief was older still, that the sneeze was a warning from within, a sign that death had leaned close enough to brush the body. And yet, against both stories, the blessing stood, spoken with the kind of faith that grows in the soil of despair. The candles burned lower, their light softening to a haze. Somewhere outside, wind stirred the dead leaves along the cobbles, and the sound was like dry paper tearing. The hall smelled of tallow and damp wool, the mingled scents of life pressed together in tight quarters. Each person in the room knew the risk of gathering, yet none could bear the long nights entirely alone. When the child woke again, she sneezed once more, a smaller sound this time, but enough to stir the watchers. And again the blessing came, from more than one voice. It was almost a chorus, hushed but certain, the syllables overlapping like the weaving of a net. The child looked around at them, blinking, and gave the smallest of smiles before sinking back into the shawl's embrace. In that moment, the blessing was more than a guard against death. It was a hand on the shoulder, a wordless promise that someone had seen you, had marked your breath and held it safe in memory, and perhaps in ways no one could measure. That was what kept people alive in the long winters, the knowing that someone would speak for you in the instant, when your body faltered. When dawn came, pale and thin, the hall emptied in twos and threes. They stepped into streets still wet from the night's rain, each carrying with them the smell of smoke and the echo of quiet voices in the dark. Some would not live to see another Candlemas, another spring, but the words would endure, slipping from mouth to mouth, passed down without ceremony. Even centuries later, when the plague had passed into the pages of memory, the blessing would remain, spoken to strangers in marketplaces, to friends across kitchen tables, to children running in the sun. No one would remember exactly why the words had been born, only that they must be said, that something ancient and fragile rested in them. Somewhere, in the quiet space between breath and silence, the sneeze still opens its small door. And somewhere else, a voice still answers, sewing flesh and soul together again with nothing more than a prayer. The wheels of the cart groaned against the rutted road, their rhythm swallowed by the long hush of evening. Overhead, the last of the light bled from the sky, turning the clouds the color of dying embers. The air smelled faintly of damp hay, wood smoke, and the sharper tang of horses worked hard in the cold. The traveller rode with his cloak drawn close, its edge pressed to his jaw to guard against the wind. A small leather pouch hung at his belt, its contents shifting with a soft, crystalline weight, salt white as moonlight, fine as ground frost. In this land, it was more than seasoning. It was protection, wealth, and covenant, a thing worth guarding, as one would guard the last coal in the hearth. The road passed between hedgerows, blackened by winter. Now and then, the cartwheels jostled over stones hidden beneath the mud, making the pouch of salt knock lightly against his thigh. He thought little of it until his hand, reaching for his flask, caught the pouch instead. The cord loosened, a pale stream of grains spilled into the folds of his cloak, then onto the road, where they vanished into the earth. The traveller froze. The reins slackened in his grasp. In the failing light, the fallen salt shimmered like a small patch of snow. A sudden unease pressed against him, old as childhood warnings. In the stories his grandmother told beside the hearth, to spill salt was to squander its power, to let slip the unseen shield it cast over hearth and body. And worse, to spill it unguarded was to invite the devil's gaze. Without hesitation, his hand darted to the pouch. 2 pinches between his fingers, quick as sleight of hand, flung back over his left shoulder. He did not look behind him, never look, the elders had said. The devil stands there, waiting. Throw the salt, let it strike his eyes, and he will turn away. The gesture was done almost before it began, but its echo lingered. The horses snorted, ears flicking. The wind shifted, carrying a faint dry scent, as if the salt itself still hung in the air. The traveller tightened the pouch's cord and tucked it deep into his cloak. It was said that salt marked the boundary between order and chaos. It could preserve food against rot, purifying water, keep away what should not be near. Kings were paid. In it, oaths were sealed over it, and to break bread without it was to risk friendship itself turning sour. Yet its lost those scattered grains was an opening, an invitation. In the villages, such spillages were met swiftly. A mother might stamp the floor 3 times to seal the breach. A farmer, caught unawares at table, would sweep the grains into his palm and toss them over his shoulder without rising from his bench. The poorest would still do it, even if the salt they scattered was worth a meal. For some protections were worth more than hunger. The road grew narrower, the hedgerows pressing in. A mist began to curl from the ditches, silvering the air until the traveller could no longer see far ahead. His lantern swayed from the cart's side, casting long blades of shadow that sliced across the path. He remembered another road, years past, when he had travelled with a peddler too old for the weight of his wares. That man had spilled his salt at a wayside inn and forgotten to cast it away. The next morning he woke with a fever that burned him hollow by nightfall. The villagers said nothing aloud, but their glances told the story that the devil had stood at his left shoulder all night, breathing ruin into his ear. The traveller's horse shifted, uneasy. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, a low sound moved through the mist knot. Quite a voice, not quite the wind. He kept his eyes forward, gripping the reins until his knuckles whitened. The pouch of salt felt heavier now, its weight an anchor against the unseen in the darkness behind him. The road he had passed seemed to lengthen. Every cart's creak, every hoof-step, was answered by something softer, a sound that matched his pace. He resisted the urge to look. The mist thickened until the lantern's light reached no further than the nearest wheel. The world beyond that pale circle was shapeless, waiting. He reached once more into the pouch, feeling the dry coolness of the grains. Another pinch over the shoulder, quick, precise, without thought. The horses settled, their ears flicking forward again. Salt was precious, but the elders had taught that to guard one's soul was more precious still. Better to waste a handful than to travel unguarded. Better to make the gesture and never need it than to walk unwitting into ruin. At last the road widened, spilling into the outskirts of a sleeping village. The mist thinned, lanterns glimmered in windows, and the smell of warm bread drifted faintly on the air. The traveller's breath eased. He passed beneath the low arch of the gate, the cart's wheels thudding over the threshold stones. Only then did he glance back. The road behind was empty, the hedgerows still, the mist lifting like a curtain drawn aside. The grains he had thrown were gone, swallowed into the earth. He would not speak of it at the inn. He would not tell how the hair on his neck had lifted, how the air behind him had seemed too thick to breathe. These things were known without being said. Tomorrow, when he rose to travel again, he would check the pouch's cord twice before setting out. And should the salt fall again, he would waste no time in making the gesture, for in such acts memory lived. Not the kind written in books, but the older memory carried in the marrow, whispered in kitchens, pressed into the hands of children learning to walk steady on dangerous roads. A knowledge that some boundaries cannot be seen, and some guards are made not of walls, but of the smallest of things, bright and white and fleeting. And so the salt would always be kept close, and the hand would always be ready. For the devil waits behind the left shoulder, and the night is long. The heavy oak door groaned like a waking beast as the knight pushed into the ancient church, his boots echoing softly upon the cold stone floor. Outside, the wind stirred the bare branches against a sky bruised with twilight's fading hues. Within the quiet sanctuary, candlelight flickered against carved pillars, throwing long shadows that danced like restless spirits. It was Wednesday, a day wrapped in the whisper of gods long vanished yet never forgotten. To some, it was merely the middle of the week, but to others, those who still listened to the old ways, it was the day of Mercury, messenger and trickster, the unseen herald of journeys and secrets. Tomorrow would be Thursday, sacred to Jupiter, king of gods, bearer of thunder and fate. The night, cloaked and hooded, moved with the solemnity of one who knows the weight of such days. His hands, calloused and stained by the sword's grip, lifted the hem of his cloak to step lightly around scattered ashes and broken pews. He was not a man of fleeting faith, but a keeper of hidden truths. A soul tethered to the fragile thread between the sacred and the profane. In this land, superstition was not mere folly, but a tapestry woven from the fibers of memory, fear, and hope. The old gods had not vanished. They had merely slipped beneath the surface, wearing the faces of saints and angels. The people spoke in hushed tones of days cursed or blessed, each a talisman shaping the shape of their lives. Tuesdays were forbidden for weddings, for they bore the name of Teve, the god of war and strife. To marry on Tees Day was to invite discord and bloodshed into union. Harvests waited upon astrologers' nods, the turning of stars dictating when earth might give its bounty. Jupiter's Day, Thursday, was a day of power and portent, yet many dared not begin journeys or ventures upon it. Fearing the weight of misfortune, the knight knelt before the altar, its surface worn smooth by centuries of prayers and secrets. His fingers traced the faint carving of a serpent, entwined with a cross symbols, entwined like old and new beliefs, forever locked in sacred embrace. The air was thick with the scent of wax and incense, a fog of memory hanging heavy as ancient stone. He whispered a prayer, not just to the God of the church, but to those older forces beneath, hoping to bridge the worlds. For him, each weekday was a key, a lock, a signpost pointing to hidden paths where fate and will tangled like roots beneath the earth in villages far and near. People moved to this rhythm, their lives paced not by clocks, but by the cadence of cosmic decree. A child born on a Mercury day was said to be blessed with cunning and silver tongue. One born on Jupiter's thunderous hour, destined for greatness or ruin. The very naming of days was a relic of those who danced with gods long past, their stories folded like the pages of a weathered grimoire. As candlelight flickered, the knight rose and walked slowly toward the nave. His mind wandered to tales told beside hearths, stories of travelers who dared to begin quests on Jupiter's day, only to be swallowed by shadows, or of lovers whose unions sealed on forbidden Tuesdays, their happiness shattered like brittle glass. Outside, the evening deepened. The first stars pricked the sky, silent watchers over a world still caught between light and dark, faith and superstition. The church's bells, hung heavy with centuries of sorrow and hope, told the hour, their sound rolling like thunder in the night. The knight stepped back into the chill air, the cloak drawn tighter. Behind him, the church stood solemn and eternal, a guardian of both whispered prayers and forgotten gods. The days would turn again, Wednesday to Thursday, and onward, each bearing its own secret weight, its silent covenant with those who heed the old ways. And in this endless turning, the world held its breath, caught between the ticking of mortal time and the timeless dance of gods unseen. The dusk folded over the forest like a deep silken veil, softening the edges of the ancient trees that rose like silent sentinels into the violet sky. A woman moved through the shadows, her steps light. On the moss and fallen leaves, each footfall a whispered secret against the hush of the wood. She carried a small basket woven tight with reeds, its contents carefully gathered sprigs of evergreen, polished stones, a shard of bone, and a handful of dry earth crumbled from the roots of a tree older than memory itself. Her breath formed, pale clouds in the cooling air, mingling with the scent of damp wood smoke and the faint, sweet decay of autumn's last bloom. The forest was a place suspended between worlds, a liminal space where the breath of gods long past still stirred the leaves, and where shadows gathered with purpose beneath the gnarled limbs of ancient oaks. The woman's hands trembled as she reached the clearing, an open glade cradled by towering trees, where the earth was bare except for a ring of stones worn smooth by countless years. This was a Nimida, a sacred grove, a sanctuary whispered of in the decrees of distant bishops, who sought to claim these wild places for their churches, branding their rites heresy. Yet here, deep in the heart of rural Germany, the old ways clung, like ivy to stone, stubborn and unyielding. She knelt before the stones, fingers tracing the worn knots carved into the largest monolith, intricate spirals and loops, signs meant to bind evil and hold chaos at bay. These knots were more than ornament. They were the language of protection, a cipher left by hands that knew the thin veil between blessing and ruin. With reverence, she set her offerings, a small fire kindled not by flame but by friction, the ancient spark coaxed from wood rubbed fast between palms, alive and fragile as a newborn's breath. The flame leaped, casting a flickering glow that danced like spirits awakened, filling the glade with light as darkness crept back from the edges. She whispered a prayer, half song, half incantation, words old as the hills, naming Mercury and Jupiter, but through the lips of saints now, their pagan names folded into the fabric of new faith. In this twilight world, superstition and religion were threads woven tight, indistinguishable yet inseparable, each ritual a heartbeat against the silence of oblivion. Around her, the forest held its breath. The air thickened with the scent of burning wood, resin, and something more elusive, a lingering pulse. A memory of rites danced long ago beneath these very boughs. The woman's hands moved to the soil, planting seeds in the stony earth. A promise of life amid ruin, a covenant with seasons yet to come. Legends told of bishops' men who hunted such rites, tearing through villages with fire and sword to root out pagan shadows. Yet the Nemidas endured, hidden beneath the cloak of saintly names and whispered prayers. To plant, to carve, to kindle fire was to resist erasure, to claim space for the old gods in a world tilting toward oblivion. The woman rose slowly, eyes shining in the firelight, her silhouette a fragile bridge between past and present. The offerings would stay until dawn, until the first sunbeams broke through the mist, blessing the ground anew. The forest exhaled, ancient and eternal, cradling the rites in its embrace. Long after the woman's footsteps faded into silence, the grove remained a heartbeat in the wilderness, waiting patiently. The old gods may have slipped beneath the surface, their names altered and their faces hidden, but in the twisting roots and whispering leaves, their breath still lingered, timeless as the stones themselves. The twilight pressed soft and heavy upon the village, wrapping the earth in a deepening silence, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and the slow, steady breath of the world settling into night. Within a small, dimly lit chamber, a child swayed gently in a cradle woven from the greenest sprigs of parsley. Its delicate leaves curled and glistened faintly in the flickering candlelight, a wreath that held the newborn in a tender circle between the worlds of light and shadow. Parsley, the humble herb, common to every kitchen hearth and table carried, a secret older than stone and blood. It was said in whispered tales, in the low voices of those who remembered the old songs, that parsley was born not of earth and rain alone, but of death itself. The first parsley had grown where a life had ended, nourished by the spilled blood of the underworld's first traveler, a sign that from darkness could come something fragile and green, a thread connecting the living to those who had passed. Beyond, in the shadowed corners of medieval homes, parsley's slow, deliberate germination mirrored the endurance of spirits. To plant parsley was to plant a pact, to wait in patient silence for life to rise again from the soil, stubborn and resilient. But the herb was not without its shadows. To eat parsley unbidden, without the turning of ritual, was to invite sorrow into the heart. To steal parsley from a neighbor's garden was to beckon grief. To pull at threads unseen and risk the cold touch of loss, the midwife's hands, steady and worn by years of tending life and death alike, had woven the wreath with care. Each sprig was placed with the weight of stories long told at firesides, of souls wandering the edge of night and returning to rest. The wreath was no mere decoration. It was a shield and a beacon, a prayer made green and living, folded into the fragile body of the child as protection and offering. Outside, the night breathed slow and full, the air thick with mist and the scent of damp earth. The village lay quiet, save for the distant toll of a church bell marking the passage of time that stretched thin between the living and the dead. On the graves nearby, parsley wreaths lay woven with equal care, feeding lost souls who wandered hungry in the dark. The herb was the common thread, the sacred garnish folded between life's breath and the afterlife's silence. The child stirred, eyes fluttering open to the dim glow. The wreath cradled it like a silent covenant, binding it to the ancient rhythm of death and renewal. In those small movements, there was a stirring of mysteries, the fragile balance between beginnings and endings, the eternal pulse of earth's breath that neither time nor sorrow could sever. The midwife watched, her gaze steady and reverent. She knew well the cost of forgetting, the price of dismissing the whispers carried on parsley's green leaves. Here in this chamber, under the watchful eye of night and herb alike, life was given its quiet protection, held safe in the fold between the realms. The candle sputtered low, casting flickering shadows that danced like spirits upon the rough-hewn walls. In the stillness, the room seemed to pulse with unseen life, the mingling of past and present, the slow weaving of fate's threads. The parsley wreath, humble yet profound, was a quiet guardian of a story older than kingdoms, a reminder that life and death walked always together, bound in endless, sacred embrace. As dawn neared, the child's breathing deepened, steady and sure, the wreath's green tendrils a gentle promise of endurance. Outside, the world awaited the sun's return, the turning of days, and the countless lives to be woven anew beneath its light. But within this quiet chamber, cradled in a wreath born of death, life swayed delicate, enduring, eternal. The heavy oak door creaked open with a reluctant groan, and a small shape slipped inside a weasel, slender and swift, its pale fur shimmering faintly in the candlelight. It darted low across the threshold, a living shadow with eyes like polished onyx, quicksilver in the hush of the medieval hall. The air trembled for a heartbeat, the flicker of flames caught in the sudden motion, and the bridesmaid recoiled, her breath catching in a sharp, silent gasp. In that small, furtive scurry lay a world of ancient dread. To many, the weasel was no mere creature, but a cursed soul made flesh, a warning whispered on the wind, a restless spirit cloaked in fur. Some said the brides unlucky in love, or wronged in life, were transformed at the altar into these pale Spectres, condemned to roam between houses and hearths, never to find peace. The hall was draped in soft tapestries and the scent of wildflowers, a celebration poised on the edge of joy and shadow. Yet the sudden presence of the weasel unsettled the air, knitting a thread of unease through the gathered faces. In far corners of the world, the sight of a weasel crossing a maiden's path was an omen, dark and heavy doom woven with delicate pores. Farmers spoke of the ritual killings come August, when the sun hung low and the harvest neared, to stave off the creeping shadow of misfortune. The talons of weasels were prized as amulets, bound tight into leather or silk, carried close to shield from unseen curses. Their soft fur was a mask for the uncanny, a cloak for the fear that crept beneath the everyday. The bridesmaids stood frozen, eyes wide, heart thrumming with the stories taught in whispered lessons beneath mother's breath and grandmother's gaze. The creature's eyes met hers briefly, black pools reflecting the flickering light, and then it vanished again, a swift ghost slipping through the cracks of the stone floor. In the silence that followed, the hall seemed to hold its breath. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows, stretching like fingers across the ancient stones. The guests looked at one another, unease settling like a slow fog. Some crossed themselves, murmured prayers to saints, or reached for charms hidden beneath garments. Yet the wedding must go on. Life and death, joy and sorrow, have always shared the same breath, woven together like threads of a tapestry both fragile and eternal. The presence of the weasel was a reminder, a soft scurry of fear in the margins that beneath celebration. Fate's shadow lurked, watching, waiting as the night deepened. The bride's laughter rang clear, a fragile bell against the dark. The guests drank and danced beneath banners bright with heraldry. But the memory of those small, quick steps echoed still, a whisper of the unseen. The weasel's passage was a silent tale told in the language of shadows, a mark left upon the heart of the night, when dawn crept pale and slow over the horizon. The weasel was gone, vanished as if it had been a dream caught between waking and sleep. But in the hearts of those who had seen the quiet terror lingered the knowledge that some omens cannot be spoken aloud, only felt in the soft, scurrying pulse of fear itself. The dawn broke slow and silver over the dew-darkened fields, the mist curling like ancient breath from the earth's soft skin. From the furrowed rows where wheat and rye tangled, a lone figure rose, her voice a fragile thread of song weaving through the chill air. A peasant woman, hands calloused from toil, feet kissed by the mud, she carried with her more than the morning light. Nestled beneath her pillow lay a bundle of straw, not mere stalks from the harvest, but the sacred Holy Marys, straw-tied, tight in knotted promise against the unseen. In the quiet hours before the village awoke, her song carried the weight of whispered prayers and old magic, the kind that lived not in grand cathedrals or gilded altars, but in hearths and heartbeats. The straw was no mere talisman, it was a thread of protection, a bulwark against hunger, illness, and the restless mischief of fair folk who danced beneath the moon's pale gaze. The church had long railed against such charms. Scrolls and sermons warned of the folly of knotted ropes, of whispered incantations carried on the breath, of stones marked with sigils that spoke to powers not sanctified. Magicians, sorcerers, those who sought to bind the world with fire made by friction or spells, sung in the hush of night, were branded as enemies of faith. Yet, beneath the stern gaze of the clergy, the people clung to these practices like lifelines, a secret weave of survival and belief in the fields and forests. In cottages where shadows gathered thick and long, Knots of protection were tied with deliberate fingers, each loop a silent prayer, each twist a shield against hunger's claw or the fair folk's trickery. Fires were coaxed from wood rubbed fast between palms, fragile flames that held back the dark and the cold. Stones bore markings not of scripture but of old tongues, sigils carved in quiet rebellion, promises etched in silence. The peasant's song faded into the dawn's first light as she crossed the threshold of her humble home, the straw beneath. Her pillow was a talisman, yes, but also a testament, a whispered pact between the sacred and the profane, a fragile shield against the world's harshness. In this tangled web of faith and magic, each hearth became a battleground, each blessing a sword. As the village stirred, children woke to the scent of baking bread and the distant call of church bells. Yet, beneath the daily rhythm, a silent war waged, a war where prayer and enchantment fought for dominion over the soul's quiet sanctuaries. The woman's knotted straw was a beacon in this twilight dance, a secret kept alive in the dim glow of candlelight and the soft sighs of the earth. Night would come again, and with it the shadows would lengthen, the fair folk would stir, and hunger would whisper its cruel promises. But for now, in the fragile dawn, the peasant carried her song and her stroll woven together in a sacred dance of hope and defiance, a quiet resistance etched into the very fabric of the world. The bell tolled, its deep, sonorous voice cutting through the dense night like a blade through silk. Each clang rolled over rooftops and cobbled streets, sinking into the bones of the village beneath a sky heavy with stars and shadow. The curfew bell called the souls of men and women home, bidding them to shutter windows, stoke dying fires, and seek refuge behind walls thick with ancient stone. It was a summons older than kings and kingdoms, sound woven from dread and devotion, a hymn sung by the night itself. Darkness here was not mere absence of light. It was a living presence, vast and hungry, stretching its cold fingers into alleys where plague's ghostly breath whispered among the sick and dying. It hid thieves who slipped silent as shadows cloaked in the night's velvet. It held demons too, unseen but felt malignant spirits, restless souls trapped between worlds, prowling the threshold where life and death entwined. The bell's toll was no mere law. It was a lullaby and a warning, a fragile thread spun between the chaos of day and the fragile order of night. When the last echo faded, it folded the day closed like a sacred book, binding memory and fear into a single breath. Behind every door bolted and every candle snuffed, there lingered faith, a desperate hope that the walls might hold, that night's darker guests might pass them by. Outside the village breathed low beneath the cloak of night. Smoke curled from chimneys where hearths burned low, the scent of wood smoke and salted meat mingling in the chill air. The narrow streets twisted like veins, silent but for the distant howl of a dog, or the soft murmur of the wind through bare branches. Lanterns swayed behind curtained windows, casting trembling shadows that seemed to shiver with unseen life. The bell tolled again, slow and measured, its deep voice an echo of ancient rites. For centuries, curfews had been set not just to snuff fires and quiet the restless. They were wards, spells cast in sound to guard the thin veil between the living and the dead. The toll was the heartbeat of a fragile peace, a rhythmic prayer against the coming dark in the stillness. The villagers listened, each note a reminder of what lay beyond the circle of their hearths. Children huddled beneath blankets, eyes wide, with whispered tales of plague and ghostly wanderers. Elders muttered prayers, clutching rosaries worn smooth by years of trembling fingers. The bell's call was both a shackle and a shield, binding them to the safety of home and the fear of what waited in shadow at the edge of town. Where the old forest pressed close, the night grew thicker. Here, the boundary between worlds thinned, place where the dead might wander and the living dared not tread. Stories told of spirits crossing at the tolling, seeking passage or revenge, their voices caught in the ringing, haunting the fading echo. The bell's final toll faded into silence, and the village exhaled its breath held tight through the long night. Windows glowed faintly as candles flickered back to life, tiny beacons in the vast dark. The curfew had drawn its line between safety and peril, waking and dreaming, this world and the next. As the first grey fingers of dawn began to pry open the sky, the bell rested, silent now until night's return. In the hush, the fragile boundary held a whispered covenant sealed by sound, faith, and the eternal dance of light and shadow.